American history and me.
And I'm me. Hello, and welcome to episode 2 of our study of American history, of my 75 years of history, and of this annus horribilis that we're all suffering through. In our first episode, we left the future of the United States in some pretty dire straits. We left me as a young and happy child in St. Louis, Missouri, and left us all stuck here in this unbelievably idiotic mass hysteria, total insanity in the year of 2020. 2020. Almost over. I don't even want to think what next year holds. But let's go back to a time, a more saner time, back to 1650, where the English colonies that would in the future become the United States had a total population of about 50,000 people, divided almost equally into two areas. Massachusetts colony kind of dominated the much of New England, and down further south around Chesapeake Bay, Virginia and Maryland colonies existed, and both of them had about 25,000 people, more or less. Virginia had just triumphed over the native Powhatan Federation, Indian tribes that they had been battling for about 40 years. And Massachusetts had won a war against the native tribes back in 1638. But the steady influx of Puritans, the reinforcements that came every year, slowed dramatically with the start of the English Civil War back in England, and especially with the victories of Oliver Cromwell. Then it ended up in the Puritans being victorious and lopping off the head of King Charles I. Back here in America, the native tribes still held vast swathes of territory and outnumbered the colonists everywhere. Inland, a great tribal confederation was expanding to become the most powerful and important native organization in all of North America, and this was the Iroquois, a confederation of 5 tribes: the Seneca, the Cayuga, the Onondaga, the Oneida, and the Mohawks. The Iroquois waged wars against many other tribes from 1630 to about 1698, known collectively as the Beaver Wars. And they expanded their territory from their home base up in northern New York, near the Canadian border, down through the Ohio River Valley, all the way out to the Mississippi River, all the way around to dominate the entire Great Lakes area, and even further south down to Virginia, where they too were battling the Powhatan Federation for some western hunting grounds. So the victorious Iroquois took their lands, scattered all the losers in all directions, setting off more intertribal conflicts, while the Iroquois took control of the very, very lucrative fur trade. Beaver furs primarily, and primarily for European hats. It looked like a great battle for dominance of the eastern United States loomed. In this corner, the colonist. In this corner, the mighty Iroquois. All a tense, nail-biting struggle for control and the future of America. Stay tuned. I'll return to this soon. And speaking of the tense and the controlled, here in California, the North Korea of North America, millions of fine people who hated President Trump because they were certain he planned on becoming a dictator have lived happily and praised the beneficent and deeply caring reign of good King Gavin, who for the past 9 months has been a most empathetic tyrant, instructing us for our own good and our protection as to who can work and who cannot. what we can do and what we can't do, where we can go and who we can do things with, and whether we can meet with other people at all. Well, wait a minute, I know the answer to that one. We're not allowed to meet in groups because that could be a super spreader event for unacceptable ideas. Thank you, King Gavin. But our glorious leader has done all this and more with a deep, deep concern for the well-being of we, his loyal subjects. Thank you and praise, oh great leader.
It's good to be the king.
Nonetheless, it remains pretty darn tense here as we gravely await the terrifying fourth wave of the coup-demic. It's about to engulf us, overwhelming. Or is it the third wave that's about to engulf us, destroying... Did we have a second wave? Was there a second wave? I do sort of remember that terrifying, horrifying first wave, that deadly wave that struck our unprepared land and overwhelmed and crashed our struggling health system. But good King Gavin managed to take control and lead us through those dark, dark days. Those terrifying days when we all thought we were going to die. But he managed to get us through those dark days and kept 99.97% of us alive. Oh, praise our great leader. Hail, good King Gavin. But now it's coming back again. They're all gonna die. We can't go through this again. We're all gonna die. Run, panic, flee. Better. Now let us leave this insanity of 2020 and return to the 1600s. In episode 1, I mentioned that my first ancestors to reach America were Puritans, who in 1635 joined the Massachusetts Bay Colony. And I'd probably been wearing some of their genes, which may explain why I occasionally display a trace of judgmental earnestness in my life, and sometimes more than a trace I display. But during the 1600s, more of my relatives and their genes arrived. Sweden also joined the colonial movement in 1638, and this brought more of my ancestors to America. As part of the colony of New Sweden, it's formed around what is now Wilmington, Delaware. The entire colony only consisted of about 600 people, but it survived and prospered enough to be seized by the Dutch in 1655. The Swedish colony really had little effect upon history, except that the homes that they built became the model, the template for the very famous American log cabins. The Dutch began and continued to grow and brought in more settlers during the 1650s and became prosperous enough that in 1664 an English fleet sailed across the Atlantic Ocean and seized the entire colony. In 1670, another of my ancestors arrived in Virginia from Ireland and came as an indentured servant. But I need to clarify something. In episode 1, I mentioned indentured servants, but some viewers were obviously very confused, and so let me explain and clarify things. Indentured servants were not dentists. nor did they make false teeth, and they didn't provide their own teeth to be made into dentures. In fact, teeth had nothing to do with indentured servants other than the fact they probably had some in their mouths. Now, I understand the confusion. Dentures, indentured, public education. But let me explain. Indenture was a contract for labor. As the cost of sailing across the Atlantic was very expensive in the 1600s, not very many people could afford it. But if you signed an indenture to labor for someone, your passage to America would be paid in return for a set time of labor, which was usually 4 to 7 years of your life working basically as a slave, completely under the control of your employer. But just try to imagine being open to leaving your home, your life, your family, signing up on a contract to agree to do a 2 to 3 month crossing of the Atlantic on a small, uncomfortable ship and experiencing bad food, bad water, dysentery, and the fear of the ship being lost in any storm in the crossing. Then you arrive in this foreign alien land where you will be purchased by an employer and then set off to live and work as basically a slave for the next number of years, and to do all of this in order just to reach America and have the hope that after the contract that you will survive the contract, and after you do, you will then be free in this new world. Very different times and people, but many people did. Many people signed up for indentures. Amazingly, more than half of all the Europeans who immigrated to America up to the time of the American Revolution came as indentured servants. These are the people who really founded and built our country. These were unsung heroes who were never really mentioned in history. The indentured could only hope that their new employer, who had just purchased their contract, and them would feed and clothe and house them and not so mistreat them that they might not live through their contracted years. And it's definitely a worry, but this was also a big expenditure, a big investment for the employers. And so they certainly had a motivation to keep the indentured servants alive and capable of working so that they could recoup the investment that they made. And so I'd say the indentured had a hope of surviving their contract and becoming free. That is, if they didn't die from infections, accidents, in some disease, some epidemic, or in fighting with the native tribes. And there's about a 50-50 chance when you left the British Isles or wherever and came to America, 50-50 chance that you would survive your indenture. Such a different time, such different people. Let's return to my life now. St. Louis, Missouri was founded by the Spanish in 1764 as they came up the Mississippi from New Orleans. And St. Louis was my home for my first 8 years of my life. And really had a great effect on my entire 75 years. I was born and raised a Catholic, and in St. Louis we attended a charming little church, the Little Flower, which is round in shape and had pews circling the altar, which is pretty cool church. And I went to the Catholic school next door and was taught by Dominican nuns. One of my aunts, my mother's sister, was a Dominican nun herself. My delightful Aunt Ree, which is short for Marie. And she was really one of the best people I've ever met in my life, I've ever known in my life. She was very sweet, gentle, and good-natured, always. A wonderful person, as were many of her fellow nuns, who often accompanied her when she came to visit. All nice, intelligent women, and why they ever became nuns has puzzled me, and still kind of puzzles me. But it was an option for many young women and for many families for many centuries. Another big change from today. I cannot recall when I last saw a nun in public, although maybe they have changed their looks to try to blend in more. And today they may be fashion trendsetters who are working on the new unisex look that our great elite leaders, such as Praise King Gavin, might very well have in mind for us in the future. Some years later, I would leave the church in a self-righteous huff, never to return. But I am thankful for the basic moral teachings that the church provided to me at an early time in my life. Being Catholic, it isn't surprising that I had a lot of cousins. My father was one of 5 children. My mother was one of 7. And I had 15 first cousins. That's guaranteed a lot of kid fun at any family gathering. To have 7 or even 5 children today is socially stigmatized. In fact, things that were stigmatized in my youth have largely been embraced by modern society, while things that were embraced back then, like religion and large families, have generally been stigmatized today. Life has changed. I didn't know much as a kid, but I did know that my entire family were Democrats. It was a Democratic family. The party of the working man, the party of the little man. At least that's what was put into my head from an early age, and it took me quite a few years to know better. I'll return to my early life in St. Louis a little bit later, but now let's return to the British colonies in America and the looming battle royale between the colonists and the Iroquois. Back in England, the news was the return of the monarchy in 1660, when Charles II regained the throne. In the intervening years, Oliver Cromwell had died, and the English people had grown tired of Puritan rule, so we're happy to re-embrace the return of the monarch. And Charles II turned out to be much more active regarding the American colonies, including the seizing of New Netherlands from the Dutch. And meanwhile, people kept coming to America. Indentured servants kept coming to work and build America. By 1700, there were now 10 colonies in America, in what would become the United States, and that included what would eventually become 12 states, including 2 that would be very important in America's future, and I'm speaking of Delaware and Rhode Island. I mean Pennsylvania and New York. Now, New York and New Jersey became colonies in 1664 with the capture of New Amsterdam. New Jersey was then given to 2 men by King Charles for supporting his restoration.
It's good to be a king.
New Jersey was opened up to all Protestants. In 1681, the king granted a colony to William Penn, which became Pennsylvania, for loans made to King Charles by William Penn's father. And Penn welcomed all religious people, at least all Christians, from Quakers to Lutherans to Catholics, even to the Amish. Pennsylvania was famous for its tolerance, and Penn was also scrupulous in his dealings with the native tribes, actually paying for additional land and treating natives as actual human beings. He also started growing oats. By 1700, these new middle colonies, New York, New Jersey, and Pennsylvania, Delaware was part of Pennsylvania then, contained more than 50,000 people. In New England, the Massachusetts colony grew and spawned offshoot colonies in Connecticut, Rhode Island, and eventually New Hampshire. By 1700, these New England colonies had about 95,000 people. In the South, the Carolina colony began in 1663 on territory given to 8 men by the king as a reward for their support in his restoration.
It's good to be a king.
The colony would later split into North and South Carolina. Virginia and Maryland continued growing, and by 1700 these 3 southern colonies, Virginia, Maryland, and Carolina, had over 100,000 people. The American colonies in 1700 now numbered about 250,000 people. Everything seemed to be pointing towards this upcoming monumental struggle, the ever-growing colonists versus the mighty Iroquois. When I was in school, the colonial era was barely touched upon. I know that we heard about the Pilgrims' arrival at Plymouth Rock and their hard work and struggles and hunger in their taming of this new and wild land. And then they celebrated Thanksgiving, lucky pilgrims, and invited the friendly natives, and they all had a good time and overate. And then we kind of rushed right on through everything else to reach Paul Revere and Bunker Hill and the exciting Revolutionary War. But this is really a very important time in our history and very unknown, especially regarding the indentured servants who risked so much to come to America. But in the history taught today, this period is still largely ignored. Even Thanksgiving now is being attacked and demeaned, and its meaning expunged by the educators. Students are taught only how the violent, racist Europeans came to America to sicken, attack, and ultimately get rid of the kindly natives, uncorrupted by Western civilization, who lived in perfect harmony with all of nature, only to find themselves now being cruelly mistreated by the racist Europeans. But it tacks on a non-historic moral dimension to our history. Now, I'm not condoning everything that the colonists did to the natives, and they did some terrible things, some despicable things, and that should be included in our history, certainly. Both sides, the natives and the colonists, were human beings. Both sides had virtues and vices. Both massacred and were massacred. They were just being human beings. And actually, racism had nothing to do with colonization, at least at first. I mean, Europeans in the 1600s, as well as Native Americans at that time, had never seen anybody of another race. So how could they even conceive of racism. Oh, they could certainly hate other people. The other was easily hated, either because of their religion or their language or their customs or whatever. Always plenty of reasons to hate somebody, but not because of race. But racism today is now the biggest slur you can hurl at anybody, and educators are keen to throw it even on the very, very earliest days of America. But it was not racism that fed colonization or gave Europeans a sense of importance compared to the natives. It was the fact that the natives were still living in the Stone Age, an age that Europe had surpassed thousands of years earlier. In American, Europeans meant natives who had no written language, who lacked the wheel. They had no horses, mules, or oxen, no cattle, no goats, no sheep. In fact, many early ancestors of these kind of animals were hunted to extinction by the natives in America. So much for natives living in harmony with nature. The natives had no textiles, no cloth, no glass, no beads, no windows. They didn't build in stone. They lacked the concept of private property, really a little vague on the concept of property at all. They had no serious ships, and they had no metal. Just think of that, no metal. The natives could live full and happy lives, undoubtedly, without these things, but it would be difficult even for we liberal-minded people to not feel superior to these Stone Agers. It is little wonder that the natives would be looked down upon by colonists as primitive and uncivilized, and it had nothing to do with skin tone. But even worse, American history's instruction has ignored or greatly degraded and downgraded the many thousands of people, desperate people, but hopeful humans who made their way to the New World in search of freedom, looking for opportunity, for land, for a better life, and they did not intend to let Stone Age people stop them, especially if they had spent years laboring as slaves prior to that. Colonists too suffered much to live in the New World, a new and better homeland for themselves and their descendants. What would these early colonists think of the cowering, masked, obedient cowards that fill America today? They probably wouldn't even have gotten on the ship. But I thank and salute them, my relatives, who risked so much just so that I could be born American. Thank you. And as for the colonists being particularly violent, well, let's admit that violence begets history.
Look at history. The Romans, the Greeks, the British, the Germans, even the Russians, all famous societies and violent ones. Have you ever heard of the Astasians? Or the Byzantines? Or the Anamantipapas? No, you haven't, and no one has. That's because they weren't violent. And don't tell me I'm wrong.
I won't. Europeans could be seen almost as meek and kindly compared to the natives. For instance, you would not have wanted the Iroquois as your enemies, or even as your neighbors. They were ferocious, fearless warriors, nearly constantly at war. They regularly took captives back to their villages and executed them as a form of entertainment. They could have invented bingo, but instead the entire tribe, the entire village, including kindly grandmas and innocent little children, all joined in the beating and the cutting and the burning and the roasting of the captives. Sometimes roasted captive was even on the menu for the day. Now sometimes to make up for losses in battle, a captive or two that were captured might be spared, not spared the long lingering torture, but their lives spared and they could be taken into the tribe as a new member or as a slave who may sometime down the line become a full-fledged member. Every native tribe had slaves. Everyone. All of them had slaves. And wars. Nearly constant wars. Many wars. Natives had no trouble massacring people. In fact, that was kind of standard operating procedure. Certainly accepted behavior between the tribes. But history today seems to only promote the evil deeds of the colonist and only the good deeds of the natives. And that's not history, that's propaganda. Epidemics are always mentioned as European diseases brought to America, and the hint is that it is done on purpose to kill off all the natives so that it'd be easy to take their land. But these diseases also hit the colonists. Smallpox and measles, yellow fever, diphtheria, influenza. These were all common causes of the deaths of colonists. 20% of Boston's population died of smallpox in 1667. It reminds me of the dreaded demic of 2020. 2020. But even as we await the great battle of the Iroquois and the colonists, it was already over. The natives were doomed to lose their land, lose their way of life, due to 4 elements, 2 of which were fatally innate in these native societies. First, there were too few natives, even before diseases struck them down. And second, there were too many tribes. No single tribe was numerous enough to defeat all the colonists, and every tribe had long-standing enemies, other tribes that they had fought with for decades, centuries even. And most all tribes lived in an almost constant state of warfare against each other. Unity was impossible, and losses could not easily be replaced. They were doomed. For instance, the Powhatan Federation that battled the early Virginia colony for decades may have only had about 20,000 people total, split into more than 30 tribes. This federation had been created just prior to the colonist arrival. Now they created it to stop the incessant warfare between these little tribes, allowing them to unite and to fight other tribes and the colonists when they showed up. There was a main chieftain, but a council of all the tribes had to be consulted prior to any big-time action being taken. And even the mighty Iroquois might have had fewer than 20,000 tribal members and split into 5 tribes. And today there are far more living members of the Iroquois nation than there were in colonial times. And today I'm sure the Iroquois make much better neighbors, and you would no longer need fear a dinner invitation from them. While each colony usually had one leader, the governor, who could make quicker decisions, and the colonies rarely fought each other. The third reason dooming the natives was European technology. And not so much the technology of guns and cannon, but of trade goods. Metal tools, knives, axes, hatchets, hoes, fishing hooks, cooking pots, things unknown prior to the arrival of the Europeans. And all these things eased the labor of the natives while increasing the productivity. And then cloth and beads made the natives more lovely to behold, while firearms improved hunting and war making. What's not to like? Because trade with Europeans enriched native lives, the tribes could not bring themselves to kill and drive off all the colonists, even when they could have done it. Tribes preferred European trade goods much more than they desired unity with all the tribes around them. And they would often side with the colonists and even fight alongside of them in battles against some of their old enemy tribes. unity was impossible. Now, the natives might have united to form large federations, large enough, numerous enough to withstand the colonial spread, and they could have learned how to produce all the goods that the Europeans provided them, all the metal objects and glass, beads, animal, all sorts of good things. Could have happened, but the fourth element would not give the natives any such opportunity. It wasn't muskets or cannon, it wasn't the horse or the wheel, it wasn't European diseases. Instead, it was what the natives noticed first upon the European arrival, and that was the ocean-going ship. As the 1600s progressed, more ships entered into the colonial trade, bringing ever more trade goods and supplies to the colonies, and thousands of new colonists every year. From 1650 to 1700, the colonies grew by 200,000 people, while the native population probably only expanded by a few thousand. The colonists now outnumbered the nearby natives, and the advantage would continue to increase every year. Doomed. The struggle was really impossible for the natives to win. It's sad. And I sympathize with the natives, and I would probably, in their place, have joined in their doomed fight for their lands and their lives. But again, life is change. So let us say farewell to the colonists and the natives at the onset of the 18th century, and let's return to my life in the middle of the 20th. Although I only lived my first 8 years in St. Louis, it left me with enduring memories and influences in my life. It was the location of my very earliest memory, which happened before I was 4 years old. It was kind of amazing now that I figured it out. I remember being taken to see my maternal grandmother, the only really memory I have of her, and went to visit her one evening on her deathbed. The reason it must have stuck in my memory was just how weird, how extremely unusual was the mood of everyone involved. They were all sad and somber and quiet, tearful even. Not at all like my mother's family, normal behavior, normal mood. Something important, something strange was happening, but all I saw was an old lady laying on her bed. At that time, death was not even a concept to me. St. Louis also infused me with Southern culture somehow. I developed a bit of a Southern drawl at that time, mostly long gone. And I also developed an affinity for the Confederacy and its lost cause. I don't recall any adult ever speaking about the Confederacy or trying to promote it, but it was part of me from very early years. Throughout my life, I've always kind of been for the underdog and try to understand the view of the other, oftentimes of the losing side. What I remember best about St. Louis in my early years there is the great fun I had playing with my brother and sister. They were always around, almost always fun. Lucky me. As long as I can remember, our family had a dog. And my sister was always nuts about canines. She still is. She loved dressing up our dog, our brave, fearless guard dog, Fritzy. I remember one day I brought a couple pals over to the house, and we were going to pick up Fritzy and go off on a little neighborhood adventure. And came up to see Fritzy wearing a dress. My pals laughed and laughed, and Fritzy looked downright embarrassed. And I had to repress my anger at the time because it was my dress. What was she doing giving my dress to Fritzy the dog? Yeesh, yeesh. I have two final memories from my youth. The first one was when I was about 5 years old, and I got very, very angry at something my mother did. And I decided I was going to teach her a lesson by running away. Running away from home. That'll teach her. So I set off with angry determination, trudging, until I reached the corner, and suddenly I realized I'm not allowed to cross the street yet by myself. So all I could do is keep trudging all the way around the block. And it was a very long block, at least a 5-year-old. When I finally got back home, I found that my mother smiled upon me, and I forgave her, and life had returned to being good again. My other early memory was probably when I was 7 or so, and it was my first experience with the otherworldly, the inexplicable, the unexplainable. At that time, I amused myself by throwing a rubber ball up against the side of our duplex, then catching it on the rebound. Probably annoying everybody inside immensely, but I guess they loved me enough to allow it to go on. We lived downstairs, and upstairs was a most delightful couple. They became honorary aunts and uncle, and my Aunt Ruby and Uncle Orville upstairs were just two more very lovely people in my life, and they became very important in our lives through the rest of their lives. And again, as I said before, I'm a lucky catching it or not. I am on the rebound. Anyhow, on that day, my pals, a couple of pals and myself, were bouncing the ball off the side of the building, and when I turned and I started to throw the ball up at the wall, when suddenly one of the windows lurched into movement and slid 5 feet across the building to intercept the ball and smash itself into bits, and then immediately fly back to its usual normal position. My pals took off running, and I just stood there amazed. And then I told everyone that the window had moved. The window had moved. And they, of course, they punished me, but they were probably a little bit lighter with the punishment as they were laughing at me. But I can still see that window moving to this day. In everyday life, there are moments that are life-changing. You may not even know that your life changed until later. But my first life-changing moment happened when my parents decided to move away, to leave St. Louis and move hundreds of miles away up to Milwaukee, Wisconsin. And I heard a voice telling me, "Go north, young man, go north." And I did. I decided to get in the car and head off with my parents. Now, had we stayed in St. Louis, I have no doubt at all, that my life would have been very, very different. Comment below, subscribe, share, hit the like button if you liked it. And two final little bits before we leave. First is our universal takeaway from human history. And in this episode, it's the very plain fact that humans are violent creatures, and groups of humans can be extremely dangerous. And finally, I would like to present the coveted Golden Turd Award in this episode to the entire American medical industry for allowing this coup-demic to rage unopposed and unquestioned by them. And they especially deserve it for the harm that they have done to children, or allowed to be done to children. With the schools closed, no reason. Pools and playgrounds and any kind of fun is banned. And they're even out wearing masks while playing outside or even walking outside. Masked. Oh. And the whole medical industry must change their outdated and ignored motto of first do no harm, because they've done plenty of harm to adults, but especially to the children of America. So kudos for whatever you think you've been doing, and enjoy your giant golden turd. You deserve it. Join us next time for episode 3 as we follow America up through the colonial period up to the War for Independence, and follow my life in Milwaukee, Wisconsin, as I adapt to winter, to cheese, and to bubblers. New word. And hopefully 2020 will finally end, although I kind of fear what's coming next. Anyhow, I'll also be discussing slavery and the onset of puberty. Exciting times ahead. So check back, subscribe if you don't want to miss it, and we'll see you next time.